I want to just create a really simple Lambda function to demo. How do I, let's start by changing the output. Okay, because I think that's an easier task, changing the output. So if I create a new Lambda function that I'm eventually going to connect to the API gateway, so I'm going to create a new function. I'm going to call this my MATC output format demo. And I'm going to create that function. Okay, so I have my function set up, and right now I return just a JSON response. So a response status code of 200 where I have a hello world from Lambda. I don't want any of that. What I want to do is I want to say my response is some other object. Right, so I'm going to create some JSON object that is my response. And let's assume that my JSON object is some kind of student. Right, so I have an ID, a name, an email, whatever other additional details I care about for a student. Okay, so I'm going to say that there's an ID, that'll be a numeric, a name, which will be some string, an email, an age, weight, that should be fine. So this is my response. I build an object that has some key value pairs. And if I save it, I should be able to test it to verify that it's working. So I'm going to configure a test event. This is no different. I don't need to pass any incoming data. This is going to be my output demo test. So I'm just passing in an empty object. And now if I test it, what will end up happening is I should see that the return value is that object. Okay, so that's what this function produces, is that object. So I'm considering Joe Blow a student. Okay. So far, so good? Okay, so now I want to connect this Lambda function to an API gateway so that I can access this function over the internet through an API. So maybe I want to write a JavaScript application that's going to connect to that URL. Okay, so in order to do that, I'm going to go over to API Gateway. And I'm going to build out a RESTful API. Okay, so I'm going to build this. I want a new API. And my API is going to be MATC output format API. Okay, and then I'm going to create the API. So far, okay?
I'm sorry, was that a REST API?
It was a REST API. And the only thing I changed was the name on the REST API. Okay, so what can end up happening is I think I showed you this last week on Thursday. I can set up different resources and different methods. So a resource would be if I'm at Madison College and I want to offer different services, like I might want to offer a service for courses. I could have a resource for the courses. I could have a resource for the students. I could have a resource for activities. I could have all sorts of different resources that are different endpoints, typically working with different sets of data. Okay, so in our case, this is fine. I have an API that already has a resource. So this API, I like to think of it as its own separate resource. I'm only building it to work with our student objects. I don't necessarily want a URL that's going to say, I don't want a URL that's going to be a two-part URL. So whatever my URL is, I want to be able to say /students. Okay, that's kind of the endpoint. So Amazon's going to generate a URL, a random URL or a domain name for me. And then at the end of that is going to be two parts. It's going to be my resource, whichever resource I define. And if I don't define one, that's fine. I can just say / is my resource. And then it's also going to have your deployment stage. Those are going to be the two parts of your URL that you can control, unless you point a domain name at your API. So if I leave it as / what's going to happen is in my stage, I can set up my stage as students. So I'll show you what ends up happening. So what I want to do is I want to create a method, not a resource. And my method is my HTTP method. So my HTTP verb, like how am I ending up at this endpoint? That's what I'm describing here. So I know that I'm going to end up there via HTTP traffic, but then which verb got me there? Was it a post? Was it a put? Was it a delete? Was it a get? Since I just want to read the student, I just want to get information, it's going to be a get. So I'm going to say for the get, I want to integrate this with a Lambda function. So remember, we are creating that request response pipeline. You'll actually see a diagram of this. What it's asking is, what's my endpoint? So this is going to be my MATC output format demo, that Lambda function that we ran that returned a student object. And then I'm going to save this. It says, you're about to give permission to execute that Lambda function. That's what I want. And now we get to visually see that request response pipeline. So up here on the top is my request coming in till eventually I hit my endpoint, which is that Lambda function. And then I get a response from the Lambda function, and I'm going through these other kind of, I like to think of them as filters. Like if I was dealing with like Ruby on Rails or ASP.NET MVC, they'd be called filters. Okay, so right now we're not doing anything with this to reshape our data, but I'm able to test this. Okay, so if I just click on test, I want to see what the return value is. I can hit test. There are no parameters. And you'll notice if I test it, you can see that I get that student object that I created in Lambda. Everyone see that response body? Life's good, so it's kind of wired up the way we want it. This will not work yet. So it's wired up correctly. So I have API gateway set up. It's wired up to access that Lambda function, which is my endpoint. It doesn't work until I actually deploy it. So the whole API eventually has to get deployed. So if I'm on the API, one of the actions I have is to deploy the API. I have to deploy it before I can actually access it over the internet. Okay, so if I deploy it, it's saying there are no stages. Do you want to create a new stage? So I have to deploy it to a specific stage. What staging is supposed to be used for is I'm going to have a development stage, a demo stage, a production stage, and I can deploy kind of that API to different stages as I'm making changes. Right? I don't necessarily want to deploy the code that I'm working on my local development machine out to production. I want to test it first. So I might deploy it to a test stage. Verify that it's working. Yeah?
So the stages are essentially like a workflow?
I don't like to think of them as a workflow. Like I think of them as separate resources. Right? So I need to test my code before I'm ready to have, it's like a different environment almost. So I can have changes to one environment that I don't have in another environment. So it relates to your workflow, right? So my workflow is I'm going to test my changes. I've made some changes. I think they're working. I want people to test it out, see how it's going, see if it works for them. They say, yep, that looks good. Then I want to let my customers see it, or maybe my internal customers see it. So I'm demoing it for them. Okay, so I deploy it to like a demo stage. Once they all say, yeah, that looks good, it doesn't break any of my other existing systems that are dependent on that API, then I'm ready to deploy it out to my external customers. Yeah. Okay, so I'm going to create a new stage, and this is kind of where I'm faking things a little bit. So I want pretty URLs. So my pretty URL is that I don't have a resource. I don't have a resource called students. I have a stage called students because my URL is going to be resource/stage. Okay, but if I don't have a resource name, it's just /, then it's just going to be stage. So whatever URL that Amazon assigns, I'm going to have /students to get to my API. Okay, so I'm going to call this students as my stage, and I'm going to deploy it. Okay, so normally if I were to name my resource, and I named it students, what it would be is students/development or students-demo, students/production. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and just invoke this URL. And you can see that I have some internet URL that's going to return a student object that has an ID, name, email, and age and weight. So this is accessible. So this is an Amazon assigned URL and then my stage name. Okay, so let's say I don't need all this information. I just want to know the ID and the email. Okay, so how this would take shape is, let's say I have different APIs for different customers, right? And maybe I, as MATC, have your social security number and have access to it. I might share student data, but I don't necessarily want to share your social security number, right? Or in this case, I don't want to share your age, right? Let's assume that that's sensitive data. So instead of writing a new Lambda function saying, hey, I want all of the student information excluding the age or the social security number or whatever, I'm not worried about it. I have a Lambda function that gives me a student, and then my responsibility is to build an API that exposes the information that I want to expose. Right? So I don't want to have a bunch of different function calls. I don't want to repeat that process to say, oh, I have a student, filter it through my code. I don't need to do that. So you give me everything and I'll filter it down to the format that I want. Okay, so right now it's everything. And I'm going to say that age is sensitive, so I don't want that in my output. Okay? So with API Gateway, if I go back to, so right now I'm in the stages section on the left-hand side. Let's be careful about where we're working. So I'm in the stages. I have to go back to the resources if I'm going to edit it. And then I have to click on that specific HTTP method to get into that pipeline, that request response pipeline. Okay, so a couple of things about this pipeline. The top two boxes are for the request. As the request is coming in, the method request, I can do validation like, did you pass in a JSON web token for authorization? Or did you pass in an API key? Or if you're inserting a new record, does it pass my model schema? Okay, so I can do those types of validations. It's more validation than anything else. Like, does it meet the validation? That would happen in the method request. The integration request would say, okay, you're sending me all this data. I don't care about some of it. I need to reshape the data to make it more easily accessible for my function. Okay. Then we finally get to our Lambda function. Our Lambda function right now is going to return a student. I can reshape the data in the integration response. And then the method response will have information about like your request or your response headers. If we're going to enable CORS, which is cross-origin resource sharing, so that we can access our API from remote domains. Okay, so all of those different filters or boxes are set up for a reason. Okay, so we're going to look at the integration response first, and then we'll look at the integration request second. And then as we go kind of forward with the course, we'll look at the method request and method response too. Okay, so this integration response, if I click on it, I have all sorts of options. And I have to drill into those options. And you'll see there are no header mappings. I can't map my headers to anything until I've set up the method response to say, hey, there are going to be these HTTP headers. But for now, we can kind of ignore some of that. So there are no header mappings. But where we're going to be working is in these mapping templates. Okay, the mapping template says I have that student object that's going to come, it's going to be my output for this API. I have this student object. That's the response from Lambda. That's what's coming here. So what's set up is for the response being JSON, so my content type is going to be JSON because that's what I'm sending back, then how do I want to configure that response? Now, this templating is not necessarily straightforward. Okay, so this templating basically says I want to map this variable to this new variable and this variable to this new variable. So I can reformat the data however I want. Okay, so the way we're doing it is fairly easy. We're just going to strip off the age or weight or whatever. We want everything, but we want to strip off some characters. If you want to get into some detailed examples, this templating language is the Apache Velocity templating. There's a whole programming language about how I can reformat and reshape my data. I usually don't use this. I'll usually just kind of look up examples as necessary. But sometimes I think I'd be better off just learning the templating language, but I don't know it that well. Okay, but you can find fairly detailed examples. Okay, so if I go into the API gateway, I can start to see some of that. So if I look at, it's not publishing, I want to say it's creating and deploying your REST API. Nope. So I want to do API gateway templating. So the first result, I can set up request and response mapping templates. So you'll see like, trying to find a good example of this. So they're showing like, here's the example of data that would come back from a Lambda function. So it has 3 properties, departments, categories, and bins. What they're doing is they create a model that says, this is what the data should look like. These are the data types for these different attributes. And then what they do is they actually, eventually, if I scroll down enough, they get into templating this. This is the templating language. So they're basically saying, go get the root element and set a variable called input root equal to the root element. And then they're saying, create an object. The object is going to have one key called choices, which is an array. Then they're going to loop through all the elements in the bins and create another object until they're done. Okay, so I can start to see what that template looks like. Okay, so we want to build a template that strips off some information. So our template's going to be way simpler than what the AWS demo is. And usually that's the case. Like if you go into the developer guide and look at their tutorials for what you want to do, usually their example is going to be way more detailed than what you need. Okay? Before I do this templating, I want to show you one alternative trick. Okay, so I'm over in the AWS documentation, and they show me how to define a schema where I define some properties. So I have an object, and then there's the different properties. So I want to show you how I can use this. Okay, so I'm going to steal their template. Okay, and I'll post this on Blackboard. But if I go to API Gateway, there's a section called Models. Right, so the whole premise of this API is that I'm going to be dealing with student objects. And if I'm building out a RESTful API and I'm going to have different HTTP verbs, I might be getting students, I might be inserting students, I might be updating students, I might be deleting students. I need to know what a student actually looks like. I know what a student looks like because I built it in Lambda. It has an ID, a name, an email, an age, and a weight. So that's what I want to define as a student object. But then I want to clarify what a student object is. I would argue that the ID is a number, the name is a string, the email is a string, the age is a number, and the weight's a number. Okay? So I want to be specific about what a student is. I want to provide a definition saying these are the properties that compose a student, and those properties are of these specific data types. Okay, if I want to do that, I do that in models. So I'm jumping over to models, and I'm going to create a model. Okay, so my model is going to be my MATC demo student, and the content type is going to be application/JSON. And then the description is optional, but I'm going to say this is my student schema for cloud for developers. Okay, so the model name is required, the content type is required, the description's not required, but I'm just putting in kind of a generic description. And then I'm going to paste that schema definition that I had taken from Amazon. My model name is going to go right here, but I'm going to call it my MATC student output model. And I'm only going to have properties, so I got to be careful about which curly braces I get rid of. So I got rid of some of the curly braces so I could blow up the font a little bit. So the properties that a student is going to have is they're going to have an ID, which is a string. They will have, sorry, it's not a string, it's a number. They'll have a name, which is a string. They'll have an email, which is a string. They'll have an age, which is a number, and a weight, which is a number. Again, I'm kind of working backwards here. I already defined what my student object looks like. And now I'm going back and saying, hey, this model matches that student object. Okay. And then I'm going to go ahead and create that model. So it shows up there as a model. This is the schema. So IDs have to be numbers, names have to be strings, emails have to be strings, age has to be a number, weight has to be a number. Okay. Now, if I go back to where I was before with the integration response, so right here, I change the font again. So the integration response, and I'm going into that mapping template, and I click on the JSON response, so when my content type is JSON, now I can choose that model as one of my templates. So if I choose that model as my template, it builds me dummy data. It says, here's the properties that I know about for a student. This is what should be there. Okay, and it gives dummy data, right? So it says the ID is going to be 314, So pi, the name's foo, the email's foo, the age is pi, and the weight's pi. If I save this right now, okay, so we don't make any changes. I just say, based on the model, I have some dummy data. If I save it right now, and I go back, and I want to test this, see if it's working. Remember, I'm going to make a request. That's all done for me. That's what the test does. I end up at my Lambda endpoint. And before, what was happening is I was returning a student that looked like this. This is what's defined in Lambda, this fake student. Now that I've defined my mapping template in my integration response, I said, no, that's not what the data is going to look like. I want to use some dummy data. I'm kind of ignoring the response from Lambda. Right? Those values were hard-coded, pi and foo for the name and email. So now if I test this, you'll notice that I get the data from the integration response, that dummy data. Okay, so we can get a little closer. So if I go back into my mapping template, let's assume that age and weight are sensitive, right? So we don't want to send that information on. I'm just not going to include it in my template. I know what the model was. I know the model included age and weight. I don't want people that are going to use my API to see that information. So I've changed my mapping template. So now I save it. I go back and test it again. And why am I not seeing that stripped off? I think it caches it. Oh, it's not even deleted. I had saved it, but... Okay, so age and weight are gone. I have to save the template, not save the integration response. Okay, now if I go back and I test it again, now you'll notice the age and weight are removed. It doesn't have the data that we want though, right? It has the hard-coded data for the ID and the name and the email. Like I probably want to get that information from my Lambda function. I just want to strip off the variables that I don't want my API consumers to see. Is that fair? So I want my actual student with the student data. So remember we were over here, so this Joe Blow. This is the data that I want. I'm assuming that Joe Blow is an actual student, but I want his age and weight stripped off. Okay, so if I go back over to my integration response, the way I'm going to get that is with that templating language. Okay, so for the ID, the way I'm going to get the ID is I'm going to use my variable input root. An input root is talking about the root element of my response. So the root element of my JSON response. So input root is really this object. So I want the input root.id. And here I want the input root.name. And here I want the input root.email. Okay, so I'm saying from my response that I got back from Lambda, I have a variable called input root, which is referring to that root element that got returned. And now I'm saying pick out the individual components so that I can build an object that looks like this. Okay, now if I go back and I test it, I intentionally caused an error. I want you to see what this looks like. So if I test this, I thought that would fail. I think it eventually will fail. And the reason I say I thought it would fail is I guess it doesn't care that it's not JSON. So Joe Blow and Joe at madisoncollege.edu is a string. Like those values are strings. I'm not doing any validation to say, hey, does this match my model? So I really want these two values quoted, my applications that are going to consume this JSON data are going to require it to be quoted, because otherwise it's not valid JSON. I screwed up how I defined my integration response. So it was really easy for me just to say, okay, here's the mapping template and use these key value pairs. But these key value pairs really should be quoted. Name and email need to be in quotes for it to be valid JSON in my response. So I save that. Now I go back and test it. And now you'll notice they are quoted. I don't even have to call them the same thing. So I know that initially I started with a student that had an email. Maybe my client application expects it to be email address. Or maybe I just have weird conventions within my organization, right? Like Lori can attest to this. We have a process called FQAS. Like, who would come up with an acronym FQAS? It means nothing, right? Like, I feel like acronyms are supposed to be like catchy. That's not catchy, right? Stupid. So if anyone outside of MATC referenced FQAS, everyone would be like, I don't know what you're talking about. So maybe I want to remap a variable. So in my database, I call it FQAS. I want to remap it to some other name so that my external customers of my API know what that data means. Okay, so email is an easy one. I want to remap email to email address. Okay, so it's nothing groundbreaking or like my example where I have no contextual meaning, but let's assume that I don't want to return email to the end user. I want to return email address. I can create a new property. Okay, now I go back, I test it. You can see that my output is email address. All of these changes are great. I've built all of these changes in my API gateway, but if I refresh this page right now, notice I still get the same exact data because I haven't deployed my changes. So my changes are sitting in development essentially. Like, there is no development stage, but they're sitting saved in development. I'm ready to push them out. I've tested it. I want a different response. Okay, so remember that you have to deploy. I'm going to deploy it to my student stage, so I'm reusing that stage. I'm going to deploy, so I'm overwriting the old version of my API. And now if I hit this URL, I still get the same data. I think it's cached. AWS is really aggressive about caching the data. Why am I still getting the same junk? I don't know if this is a new URL. It doesn't look like it. I think it just took a second for it to actually reload and get published. I think I was too quick in refreshing my clients, which is the browser, to access the data. So far okay, reshaping the data. If we want to reshape the data, we're going to be under resources, and then a specific method in the integration response is where we would reshape our data. So I don't care what comes out of your Lambda function. And this is kind of a hard concept to define and how to use this, but I might want to, and I'll be honest, I'm guilty of this. If I build kind of an end-to-end solution where I build out the API and then I build the client as well, like I build the API so that it returns exactly the data that I need. This is what my application needs, so I build the API that way, and it's really efficient. Like, my API only includes the stuff I need, but if I want to make it accessible to other people and they want to use it and make it a reusable component, what ends up happening is like their needs don't necessarily match what my needs were for data. So then I have to write additional functionality into my API. Where the reality is I probably should have wrote it so that I'm grabbing all the data and then reshaping the data. So API Gateway allows us to do that. I write one function, get me all the students, get an individual student, and then what do I want people to see? I define that in API Gateway. And what I want to see might be different from what another customer might want to see. But I only have one function on the back end. So where I actually go query DynamoDB, there's one function. Get a student, give me everything, and then I'll worry about the rest of it and filtering it and kind of saying which attributes I care about, which attributes I don't care about. Okay. So API Gateway allows me to do this. GraphQL is also a really important product that you'll see a lot of, which does this exact same thing. It says, here's my data, and then I'm going to describe how I want to access the data and filter it. So it also uses the Velocity templating engine. So there's these competing products that are doing the same thing. So if I'm outside the AWS ecosystem, I might be using GraphQL as well. It's a Facebook thing. Okay, so that's for the response. So I think the response is an easier version of this. I want to go back to Lambda. And here's my output format demo. I guess I'm just going to create a new function. I think that'll be easier. So I'm going to create a function called matc input format demo. Okay, so with the input format demo, I don't necessarily care what the response is. I kind of do, I guess. The way I'm going to handle this is I'm going to log the event, because the event is what carries our data, our incoming data. So by logging it, I'm going to be able to see it in CloudWatch. What does that object actually look like? So when it arrives at Lambda, what does it look like? It might have started as something else. Right? So you might have passed me a student object that had all sorts of details, but the reality is I only need a couple pieces of data. So I want to make sure that when it arrives at my function, those data pieces that I care about are easily accessible through this event object. Okay, and then that's what I'll return as well as the event object. Okay, so I'm not really doing anything here, but I want you to be able to see what Lambda is seeing as data gets passed from API Gateway to Lambda. Okay, so I'm going to save it, and then I'm going to test it. So I'm going to configure a test event. This is going to be my matc input format demo test. Doesn't matter what the key value pairs are. If I test it, eventually you'll see that the response is just the data that I passed in my test. Key 1, key 2, key 3, value 1, value 2, value 3. That was configured in my test. Right? If I go back and configure my test differently, so hello world, Cubs stink, and I save those data pieces and I test it, my event object is that data that was passed in. That's what we're seeing is that event object. Right? That's what our function's doing, is showing that event object, logging it to CloudWatch, and then returning it. So when we test it, we're seeing the event object, the object that gets passed into our function. Okay, let's assume that our event object, we want to get a student. Right? And in theory, our application would take that student and insert it into some kind of data store. Right? Whether it's Dynamo or some other relational database. Okay, so I have this new function, it's working. What I want to do is in API Gateway, I want to wire up another HTTP method. Okay, just a couple of things that will be relevant to you. Eventually, we're going to get into this integration request. So when we send the data and we're saying, here's the student that we want to insert, we're sending data, and then I want to reshape it so that my Lambda function only receives the data that's relevant to the function. I'm going to do that in this integration request. And this mapping template, this request body, only exists for non-HTTP GET methods. If it's a GET method, there is no request body. Okay, so if I'm doing this as an HTTP GET, I really can't reshape data. I can't pass data this way. I can't pass data through the request body. Okay, so I don't want an HTTP GET anyway. If I'm doing an insert, I'm changing the server state, then I shouldn't be using an HTTP GET. So what I want to do is I want to add a new method. The method that I want is a post, and I'm going to wire it up to my other function. So my endpoint is going to be my MATC input format demo. Okay, and if I do nothing, so I don't reshape my data at all, I should be able to test this, and I have this request body where I can pass in data. So I could say, here's the ID, 1, name, Joe, email, joe@gmail. Okay, so I can send that data in. That's what goes into my event object in Lambda. That's what's going to come out of my Lambda function.
What screen is that? The integration request?
In the integration request. Yep. So I'll show you again. I'm just going to copy this. So in the integration request, because I'm on a post, sorry, I didn't do anything. It was in the test screen. Eventually it will be in the integration request to map it. But if I test it and I scroll down, it's saying, what data do you want to send to that function? And I'm going to send data through the request body. If I test it, you'll see the response is exactly what I passed in. I passed in this object, ID, name, email, and that exact same object came out through the response. And the reason for that is because if I go back over to the function, that's exactly what happens. The object that comes in, that event object that comes in, that's what I return. I can see that in my monitoring. So if I go to my monitoring and I go to CloudWatch, so here's my latest stream at 1:13. Doesn't look new enough, but maybe it is. You can see it happened at 1:17. So the ID, name, and email came across. That's what I'm logging. That's where that console.log goes. Okay, so let's assume that I don't want the name. I just want the ID and the email. So when I test it, I'm sending 3 pieces of data. I want to filter it down to 2 so that those things are accessible through my event object. Okay? So if I go back, in the integration request, there's this mapping template again. What's going to happen is this request, when no template matches the request content type header, then it'll just pass the request body to my function. I don't want that. I want to do that only when there are no templates defined. It tells me that that's the recommended, but that's not the default. And the reason that's the case is because there are no mapping templates defined by default. Okay, so I'm going to add a mapping template. I'm going to add a mapping template to say when the request is an application/JSON request, the content type in the request is application/JSON, then this mapping should happen. Now I can click on it. Did everyone see how I added it? So I add a mapping template. It kind of gives me like, hey, I think you want application/JSON, and for the most part I do. But there are other types. So I could say application/XML. Like there are other content types. Once I add it, then I'm able to click on it to add a mapping template for that specific content type. I can generate a template, again, based on my model that I've defined. So that model being defined is helpful for me, especially if I don't know the templating language. So typically the way I will handle it is I will define a model. Like even if I'm not validating the incoming data to make sure it exists, I'll use the model. So I know that I'm getting sent these 3 pieces of data, right? ID, name, and email. That's the premise that I'm working under, is you're sending me those 3 pieces of data. I don't want all 3 pieces of data. I just want the ID and the email. Okay, and I'm not even going to change the values yet. I don't care about changing the values. I'm just going to go ahead and save this. And now if I go back and I try to test this, I'm sending in 3 values, but my integration request is filtering it down to just 2 values, just the ID and the email. And it's in fact using fake data, right? Like the ID and the email is fake data. It's not the data that I sent in. So when I test it, you'll notice that I just get the ID and the email. Because before I get to my function, I'm filtering down the request data. I'm saying don't send everything. I don't want everything. I only want the ID and email. Filter down the data that's relevant to me, that ends up at my function. And then my function is just returning the event object. So what we're seeing is what Lambda is actually receiving. So Lambda is receiving that as the event object. Yeah?
And that was filtered in the input and not the output?
Correct. Right? So if I'm looking at this, I like to think of this as a pipeline. Like I'm going from the method request to the integration request to the function. I get to the function and then I'm about to send it back to the browser or to whatever client I'm using. So this is like if we're talking workflow, I initiate the request and then my request is kind of going through all of these filters and then coming back out the other side. Okay. So in the integration request, I've defined that mapping template. The mapping template doesn't necessarily make sense in just using dummy data. Obviously what I want is the incoming requests data. So I want this input root .id and input root .email. I think this is what I was expecting. So what ends up happening is I'm sending this data as JSON. This is not valid JSON because I don't have quotes around the email. So remember I told you when we were sending back the response I need quotes around it. I think it'll crash now because it's expecting me to send JSON to my Lambda function. I'm not sending JSON. There's no quotes around the email. So if I save it and we test it, so I'm sending in these 3 pieces of data. I test it, and now you'll notice that I get an error. It couldn't parse the request body into JSON. It's nice when you already know what the error is, but if you don't know what's going on, like it kind of looks right without putting quotes there, but I need quotes around my template. So I need quotes around this email for it to be valid JSON. And now if I test this, so my request body can include anything, right? As long as there's cats. It's a collection. And Fido and Sparky and Boots. Those are my cats, right? I don't have any cats, but I can send whatever I want. It doesn't matter. What's going to end up at my Lambda function, because of my template, it says go grab the ID and go grab the email. And that's what should go on to my Lambda function. So even though you said, yep, I'm going to send you my cats, doesn't matter. I'm just throwing that away. Okay, so now when I test this, you'll notice that I just get the ID and the email. That's what's actually getting to Lambda So I'm taking whatever gets to Lambda and returning it back out. So it doesn't matter that you sent me a name or a collection of cats. As long as it's valid JSON, it's fine. I filter it down to pick off the pieces that I want. I might even decide I don't want it to be called the same thing. So this is actually really helpful if I want to change my API. So I already told you about FQAS here. Like, let's say someone rational comes along and says, hey, that acronym sucks, let's rename it. Right? So we update it. I want to change the API to the updated name to something relevant because it's relevant. Well, like changing an API breaks a lot of client applications, right? So maybe what I do is, instead of having them change their request to send in the new API name, I just change it here. I reformat their request, whatever I need it to be. And I can conditionally do that if a key exists. So again, we'd have to dig into the velocity engine, but I can do conditionals. Like if one attribute exists versus another as the API is changed, as opposed to having people update to the latest and greatest API, I can say, look, I'm going to roll out this API. I'm going to change it. It's going to affect me, but it's not going to affect my end users. So we can reshape our data. Okay, so where I want to leave off on this is I know that I have to deploy this, right? So I've made my change. I want to deploy it. Okay, so I'm going to deploy this API. Okay, life's good there. And then I want to invoke this URL. So I get my student. So it'd be nice to be able to write an application that accesses this API. Right? So if I break out into Atom, and let's say I was just going to build some JavaScript application that was going to access that API. So I want to start with an HTML page. I keep hitting. I just want to start with an HTML page. Right, and then I'll have an external script, api.js. So I'll save this. I'm just going to save it on my desktop as index.html. And then I'm going to create this JavaScript file. And let's assume I'm going to do that on the load event. I'm just going to go grab that data from my API. So window.add event listener, load init. And then here's my init method. Right? What I want to do is I want to define my URL equal to that API endpoint. Sorry, this guy. That's the URL that I want to fetch. And then I'm going to get data back, right? And that data is going to get sent to a function, which I'm going to return data.json. So I'm formatting the data as JSON. I want to work with it as data. Then I'm getting my student that I can just log. That'd be ideal. So I have this API, I go fetch the data, I convert the response to JSON, and then once I have that response as JSON, I'm calling it a student, and I want to log that student. I want to actually log this student object. And I'm jumping ahead for the advanced JavaScript students. Like, this is what we're going to cover. So no one knows this JavaScript in this class, I don't think. It's fine. If you know it a little bit, that's great. Let me try to run it, though. So if I open this up in let me open it up in the live server. And then I want to bring up the developer tools. I'm blocked. I can't access it. And if you see why I'm blocked because of this cross-origin resource sharing policy that's in place for my API. It's basically saying my API is not accessible to anyone unless it's coming from the exact same domain where the API is hosted. So if the domains match, then my CORS policy will say, yep, that's fine. We're not doing cross-origin resource sharing. But since the API is hosted on Amazon and my code is hosted on my local machine, I don't have access to that API. I need to fix that. Right? Like this is usually not how you build APIs, so that only your domain can access them. If you're building an API, it's really to share data. So it's broken. The quick solution, this is kind of a quick solution. If I go back to resources and actions, I can enable CORS. And basically there's all sorts of headers here. I'm going to enable CORS, and I'm going to deploy this API. So now CORS is enabled, and hopefully I'm able to access my data. So that's the quick solution, but I think CORS and that cross-origin resource sharing requires a little bit of explanation, like, yep, it worked. It looks like it's just kind of point and click. It's really not point and click if things go wrong. Okay, so that's kind of where we're going on Thursday, is what is CORS and how do I deal with it and what are those headers. Okay.